He was mostly lower class, Italian, Irish um, immigrants that came to America. Tough kids, very, very tough.
Did you get in any fights?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that was part of the whole thing was to be constantly getting into fights. It was difficult because my mom was very educated. Um, she was tough. She grew up on the Lower East Side, but she was a college graduate. She was a psych major. And she never really yelled at me. She would always explain things in a very intelligent way. She treated me really as an adult. And I remember my first day in the neighborhood, I said, how do you make friends? And she said, well, darling, you simply tell them you're a new boy in the neighborhood and they'll play with you. And I think my mom really wanted a girl because, in those days I had hair. And so I had a big pompadour and a little suspenders, a little tie, little shorts, little socks and buck shoes. And I went out, and these kids all ripped T-shirts, and they were smoking cigarettes, and every other word was an expletive. And I remember they were all playing on this Con Edison truck, and I said, excuse me, fellas, I'm a new boy in the neighborhood, and I'd like to play with you. And I've never forgotten, they just froze and they looked at me because it was as if I was from another planet. And they said, oh, hey, look, a faggot. And I'd never heard that word. And the next thing I knew, they were all pummeling me and beating me up. And I went home crying. But my mom figured, well, boys will be boys, new neighborhood, and because my father was killed in the Second World War, so it was just my mom. So every time I would come downstairs and they would see me, they would say, oh, there's the faggot kid, let's beat him up. So this went on for quite some time. So I remember going upstairs one day, I was crying, I said, I want you to go downstairs and beat those boys up. And my mom said, you've got to learn to fight your own battles. And with that, I thought, okay, for you, I'm divorcing you. And I went downstairs and I went to the library, which was across the street. In those days, you weren't allowed to cross the street unless an adult took your hand. But I crossed the street myself. And I went to the library, and there was this tall librarian. And I said, I want a book on fighting. So she gave me a book by Joe Louis with all the pictures of stances and stuff. And I practiced the stances and the pictures and cursing. Because in my house, my mom never, the worst thing my mom would say is, damn. But these kids, every other word. So I practiced rehearsing my hall downstairs so my mother wouldn't hear me. And of course, I was waiting for God to strike me dead. And then one day I came out and they turned the corner. There's this tough kid, Francis Schaefer was his name, tough Irish kid. And you couldn't call him Francis because it was a girl's name. You had to call him Babe. And he was the leader. And he said, hey, there's the faggot kid, let's beat him up. And so they all came rushing. This was in front of my house, and I practiced my Joe Louis stance. And I said, come on, I'll take you on one at a time, one at a time. So Francis Schaefer said to this kid, Johnny Fortunello was his name. He said, hey, did you hear what he said about your mother? Oh, he said this and that. Of course, he was making it up. So Johnny had to defend his honor, so we got into a fight, and I didn't know why I was swinging, and by accident I hit him in the nose, and his nose started to bleed. When you're 7, 8 years old and you see blood, oh, and he went running home, and they said, hey man, we didn't know you could fight. I said, I didn't want to hurt anybody, and from that point on I was more or less accepted, but I still had to get into fights. It was a very tough neighborhood. And in those days we had trolley cars and buses that had a hookup to the electric, so we would hitch the buses. And it was an education, to say the least. There are tons and tons of stories, but just to give you a flavor of what it was like.